Hi, my name is Taryn and welcome to A British Audiophile. If you're getting started in this hobby, have you ever thought about how much to spend on a turntable, a DAC, a streamer or a CD player? Source components if you like. Well, I've always thought of buying a turntable a bit like, I was going to say getting married, but it's not that big a commitment. Let's go with getting engaged instead. And buying a DAC a little bit like buying designer clothing. What the frig am I talking about? Let's find out. So let's get some housekeeping out of the way first. This video is part of a series. I've done a video on how to select a pair of speakers. I always believe that you should start with the speakers first. And I've also done a video on how to choose an amplifier to work well with those pair of speakers. So if you haven't seen those two videos, watch those first. This will make more sense. And this video is really aimed at people who are new to the hobby, getting started. But I would ask my hardened audiophile viewers to watch and maybe share their advice about source components in the comments section as well. So let's start with analog sources first. Now I'm aware that cassette decks have had a little bit of interest of late, but there seems to be very little hardware or software floating around, and I think it's unlikely that most people are going to come across that format unless they've got a cassette deck floating around from a bygone era. And I think the same is true for reel-to-reel. It's a high-end format. It's not something that somebody new to this hobby is likely to come across. So I think turntables is where it's at with regards to analog sources. Now, what I meant by the intro where I said that it's a bit like getting engaged is that you should be looking to have a long-term relationship with your turntable. Now, the reason why is that vinyl and turntables are a very mature format. If you take a look at what's happened in turntable development over the last 20 years, you'll find that there's very little, and it's equally likely that very little will happen in the next 20 years. So you've got to ask yourself this question: how often do you want to replace your turntable? It's not going to get out of date. My advice is to invest a little bit more, even if it means you having to wait and save up for it. I would jump in around the £250 mark. For that price, you'd get something like a Project T1 or a Rhaegar planar one. The reason I mention those two brands are that they have an excellent pedigree in terms of producing quality turntables at sensible money. And you could put those two turntables at the end of speakers around the £600 price point, amplifiers at a similar price point, and they won't show their limitations at all. It's only when you get to around the £1,000 price point for amps and speakers that you may want to consider upgrading. And then when it comes to upgrading, I wouldn't upgrade in bite size. I would jump from them into something like the Project, I think it's Debut Carbon, that's around £500, and there's a Rhaegar Planar 3 around the £600, £650 price point. Something like that you could quite comfortably put at the end of £2,000 worth of speakers and £2,000 worth of amplification, and they'll work absolutely fine. It'll be a nicely balanced system. And you could live with most people, I would say, would be able to live with a P3 or a Debut Carbon for the rest of their life, especially if all they do is upgrade the cartridge or the tone arm. Most music is consumed digitally, either via people's phones or on a computer. Now, those digital files have to be converted into an analog musical format, and the job of doing that falls upon a DAC or digital to analog converter. Now, your phones and your computers have DACs inside, but they're really not optimized for audio performance, and they sound pretty awful if truth be told. So you want to get those out of your signal chain as quickly as possible. The good news is that external high-performance digital to analog converters have never been more affordable. Something like the SML M300 Mark II that I reviewed, it's available on Amazon. I think last time I checked it was £213. Well, that's a fully featured digital to analog converter, and that can take on that duty and be the front of a relatively high performance audio system. You can stick it with amplifiers at around the £1,000 price point and speakers at around the £1,000 price point, and it'll be absolutely fine. And it's only when you get above that price point that you really need to think about upgrading. The other issue that you need to be aware of is that the law of diminishing returns kicks in much quicker with DACs than it does with other components, certainly when you compare it to speakers and amplifiers. Now, to illustrate this point, take me as an example. I use a Chord Mojo that retails for £400 to be the front end of a system where the amplifiers and speakers retail for around £5,000. £400 DAC feeding £5 worth of amp and speakers. Seems like it's out of balance, but it isn't really. Now, I admit I'm cheating a little bit. Chord Mojo is designed for headphone use. If it was a full desktop DAC with that functionality, it would retail for quite a bit more. But I have tried more expensive Chord DACs in my system. Tried the Cutus, tried the Hugo. Hugo 2 retails for £1,800, and I think the 80-20 rule applies. Chord Mojo offers around 80% of the performance for around 20% of the price. Now, the 80-20 rule might be one reason why there's a little bit of inertia on my part to throw the best part of £2,000 at a DAC, but there's another reason, and that's the issue of longevity. Now, some might argue that DACs have been around for quite a while and it's a relatively mature format, but I'd argue against that for a bunch of reasons. The old way of carrying out digital to analog conversion was to use an R2R ladder network. Now, these type of DACs have had a bit of a resurgence of late due to the advent of high tolerance precision resistors. And I understand the appeal. There's a beauty, a simplicity and elegance to the way the digital to analog conversion is done compared to modern DACs where signal is much more heavily processed. I think it was Einstein who was commenting about quantum theory and the complexities of it compared to his very simple and elegant theory on relativity, who said the universe should be made of marble, not wood. Wow, that's the most geeky analogy ever. In any case, R2R DACs don't particularly measure that well, and that's one of the drawbacks of that type of technology. Most modern DACs use a delta sigma conversion to convert the digital signal into an analog waveform. Now, these measure a lot better with much lower distortion, but I'll let you into a bit of a secret. We like a little bit of distortion, just needs to be the right type. Whether it's R to R or delta sigma, there's problems with all modern DACs. Just take a look at the artifacts that are created. Compare what comes out of a DAC with the original analog waveform and you'll see all kinds of issues. There's problems like post-ringing. That's where you've got a ripple after the original waveform. Even worse, there's pre-ringing. That's where you've got a ripple before the original waveform. And the digital filters themselves are problematic. If a manufacturer tries to create a linear phase filter, that's one that has accurate timing across the entire frequency range, they won't get a flat frequency response. If they try and create a flat frequency response, they won't get linear phase. There are problems with the interface. If you're using a coaxial or optical input into your DAC, that's a multiplex signal. It relies on the Sony Philips digital interface, that's SPDIF if you like. And the issue is that when it's transported, the clocking information and the data are combined together and transported. Your DAC then effectively has to unpick that the other end. USB is marginally better. It's still multiplexed, but at least the clocking information is taken care of by the DAC rather than the transporting device, which in a lot of cases could be relatively low end if it's your phone or your computer. So that's what they call an asynchronous input. There is a pure digital format inside your DAC which is called I2S, and it is possible to export data in that format. And you will see that on some high-end players, transports which basically output in I2S and DACs that receive in I2X. But as of yet, there's no particular standard format in which way to transport that data. Some high-end DACs will upsample your signal. Now let's take the Chord M scaler as an example. That retails for £3,500 as a bolt-on to one of their DACs. Now that does two things. The first thing it does, it takes the 44.1 kilohertz signal and upsamples it up to a maximum of 768 kilohertz. The second thing it does is it has a huge amount of processing power, and that's used in the interpolation filter. Now the job of the interpolation filter is to fill in the gaps between one digital sample and the next, and the chord M scaler has 1,000,000 taps. And what that basically means is it runs the interpolation algorithm 1,000,000 times between one sample and the next in order to better recreate transient information. Now, some of this technology with regards to upsampling and the huge processing involved in the interpolation filter, I think will trickle down into more affordable DACs in years to come. The bottom line is that I think a £200 DAC today will outperform a £1,000 DAC from 10 years ago, and I think the same is going to be true 10 years from now. Something like that SMSL M300 Mark II that I reviewed. Now I mentioned that DAC because it's fresh in my mind, but there's a lot of good DACs around that price point. That's going to be absolutely fine on the front of amplifiers up to £1,000 and speakers at a similar price point. It's only when you're going above £1,000 I think that you're going to need to get something significantly better. So my advice is get the DAC you need to get the job done. Be aware that it perhaps is going to become out of date within 5-10 years, and don't spend any more than you absolutely need to. Now let's talk about CD players for a moment. For those of you who are still listening to CDs, I wouldn't advise anybody who's getting into this hobby to go out today and buy a CD player. The likelihood is you've probably got some device in your home that will serve as an optical transport, most likely a Blu-ray player. All you need to do is make sure that your Blu-ray player has a digital output that can connect to an external DAC. The reality is that the Blu-ray player makes a fairly decent optical transport. It's a much more competitive area of the market than the CD player market. And you only really need to be concerned about dedicated CD transports when you're looking at high-end systems, well in excess of £1,000 for your speakers or your amplifiers. And I think a similar argument can be made for streamers. Your phone or your computer will make a good streaming transport. Just don't rely on the internal DAC. You need to connect them to an external DAC. And again, a dedicated streamer has its benefits, but again, if you're looking at amplifiers and speakers above the £1,000 price point, that's the time to start considering a dedicated streamer that will help lower the noise floor and give you the improvements in sound quality. So that's my run through on analog and digital sources. It kind of completes the series of 3 videos. I did one on speakers, one on amplifiers, and now one on the front end sources. I do plan to do more of these hi-fi tips videos in the future, but on more specific topics. I think I've covered the basics in this trilogy. So hopefully, if you've liked this video, please hit that like button, please share it, and if you haven't subscribed already, please consider subscribing. I'd like to say a massive thank you to my 18,000 subscribers out there and my loyal followers and those people who comment in the comments section. I really enjoy those interactions, and for as long as I can, I will try and respond to every single comment. So for today, for now, a British Audiophile signing off.